For 700 years, no man had crossed this threshold. No man had lived to speak of what he saw. The right belonged to women alone. Every male statue in the house stood veiled. Every male slave was sent into the street. The doors were barred with iron. To look upon the mysteries of the Bona Dea was not trespass. It was sacrilege, an offense against the gods themselves. On a night in December of 62 BC, inside the residence of Rome's high priest, a woman's voice asked a stranger her name. The stranger hesitated. When the answer came, the voice was wrong. Every ambitious Roman dreamt of an exalted legacy that could rival the conquests of Alexander the Great. For Julius Caesar, the path to supreme authority required not just military might, but absolute political invulnerability. When a devastating religious scandal violated his own household, his dignity and power were severely tested. Instead of seeking vengeance, he weaponized the crisis, treating his family as expendable pieces on a chessboard. He severed his marriage with chilling efficiency, asserting that his house must remain completely above suspicion. Is this the mark of a visionary savior of Rome, or a hollow machine devoid of a human heart? To understand how Caesar was forged into a ruthless political machine, we must look back to the moment his insatiable hunger was first awakened. The weight of ambition. In 69 BC, elected as quaestor, Caesar was dispatched to Hispania. The rain fell on the Temple of Hercules in Gades. A young quaestor stood before the stone pedestal, looking up at the statue of Alexander the Great. The bronze eyes stared forward into the centuries. He stood at an age where the Macedonian had already conquered the known world, yet Caesar had performed no memorable actions. I have done nothing memorable at an age when Alexander had already conquered the world. The sluggish, unremarkable life weighed upon his shoulders. Turning away from the statue, he sued for his discharge. He sought a more exalted career in Rome. Upon his return, Caesar began his rapid ascent up the steps to power. In 67 BC, to expand his political influence, he entered his second marriage with Pompeia, the granddaughter of his mortal enemy, the dictator Sulla. He then rose to the office of aedile in 65 BC, and finally, in 63 BC, alongside his election as praetor, he seized the title of Pontifex Maximus, the supreme priest. The Republic stood on the edge of a blade. Centuries old, it was groaning under the weight of immense wealth, a sprawling empire, and the suffocating ambitions of its elite. The factions maneuvered in the Senate. The legions waited on the borders. Yet, amidst the cutthroat political maneuvering of the Forum, there remained an untouchable realm of sacred tradition. It was a profound reverence for the divine forces that the Romans believed safeguarded their state. The architecture of the divine. Beneath the dust of the Roman Forum today, flanked by the remnants of the Temple of Vesta, lie the weathered foundation stones of a sprawling ancient complex. If you trace the asymmetric lines of these ruins, the ground plan of a traditional Roman aristocratic structure begins to emerge. Yet, the distinct arrangement of the atria and the deeply recessed, windowless interior rooms suggest a space designed not just for living, but for absolute isolation. These stones belong to the Domus Publica. In the twilight of the Roman Republic, this was the official residence of the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome. And at this time, the office was held by Caesar. In the dying twilight of December 62 BC, the physical architecture of this house was put to its ultimate test. The sun dropped beneath the horizon, and the winter air cooled the stones of Rome. Inside the house of the supreme priest, a profound silence was meant to fall. Every male slave walked out the doors. The gates locked shut, the wooden bars dropping heavily into their iron brackets. The statues of men, carved in marble and cast in bronze, stood wrapped in linen veils. The fabric was draped over the shoulders of the sculpted figures to obscure their carved eyes. Every male relative was banished. The anniversary of the Bona Dea had arrived. The Greeks called her Gynekea. The Phrygians called her the mother of King Midas. The Romans called her a Dryad, the wife of Faunus. This was a deity so sacred, so fiercely protected by ancient dogma, that her true name was known only to the women who worshipped her. She was the patroness of chastity, fertility, and the safety of the Roman people. The festival required the absolute absence of the male form. The goddess tolerated no gaze from a man. To look upon her rites was not merely a crime. It was an unimaginable sacrilege, a direct invitation for the wrath of the gods to fall upon the entire city. The women of Rome's highest nobility occupied the halls. They walked across the mosaics as the mysteries commenced. The ancient sources are notably silent on the precise mechanics of the ritual. They were hindered by a strict religious taboo that forbade any male observation or record. It was a space where the divine and the feminine held absolute, undisturbed authority. Caesar's wife, Pompeia, stood as the host, assisted by the Vestal virgins. The air grew thick with the scent of burning incense, the smoke from the altars rising toward the ceiling as flickering oil lamps cast long shadows against the frescoed walls. The night deepened. Caesar's formidable mother, Aurelia, maintained the position of domina within the household. She walked with authority, keeping a strict watch over her daughter-in-law as she moved through the ceremonies. The Profane Intruder. The ritual was ancient, its sanctity unquestioned. For centuries, no man had ever dared to gaze upon the rites of the Bona Dea. But the reverence of the past meant little to the arrogance of the present. Moving through the darkened streets of Rome toward the Domus Publica was a figure who embodied the rotting moral fabric of the late Republic, Publius Clodius Pulcher. A patrician of noble birth, a quaestor elect, and a man defined by a reckless, almost sociopathic disregard for boundaries. In 68 BC, at just 25 years old, Clodius incited a mutiny during the Eastern Campaign. He rebelled against the harsh discipline of his own brother-in-law, Commander Lucullus. Manipulated by his silver tongue, veteran soldiers threw their weapons into the dirt and refused to march. With the army paralyzed, the nearly won Mithridatic War came to a grinding halt. Stripped of his authority, Lucullus was dismissed, and Pompey, the era's greatest general, was dispatched to take his place. Clodius had driven an army to mutiny and ruined a supreme commander. Yet he cunningly aligned himself with Pompey and other power brokers, returning safely to Rome completely unpunished. He relentlessly mocked the conservative Senate. To the destitute masses of Rome, the very existence of this mad aristocrat who shattered the establishment was pure catharsis. He discarded elegant rhetoric for the language of the streets, wielding a natural-born genius for inciting the disgruntled urban underclass. To a man who had already collapsed a Republican army from the inside, there was absolutely nothing left to fear. He had set his sights on Pompeii. Armed with the supreme arrogance of his class, he decided that the unbreachable fortress of the Bona Dea was merely a locked door waiting to be kicked down. Relying on his youth and the lack of a beard on his chin, he wore the flowing, saffron-colored dress of a woman, the fabric hanging to his ankles. He bound his hair, covered his face, and carried a lute in his hands, adopting the guise of a female musician. The night concealed his approach from the street, and he crossed the threshold of the door left open by the slave girl Abra, stepping into the sacred physical space. As the girl disappeared into the darkness to fetch Pompeii, he was left alone, unable to endure his growing impatience. He intended to reach Pompeii, but the passages of the supreme priest's residence formed a labyrinth of stone. The corridors stretched into darkness, and the layout of the vast, complex rooms perplexed him. He wandered among the marble pillars, lost. The architecture offered no direction. He stepped into a shadow and waited, while the rituals continued in the distant rooms. It was here that his audacious deception unraveled. A female slave belonging to Aurelia's vigilant retinue walked down the corridor, her bare feet touching the floor. She saw the figure standing in the shadows and approached the lute player. Stopping, the maidservant playfully asked the strange woman for a name, and where she came from. Clodius hesitated. The silence stretched between them. When the maid pressed him, forcing him to speak, he opened his mouth. He stated he sought a servant of Pompeii named Abra. The syllables left his throat, and the deep, unmistakable resonance of a masculine pitch broke the sacred silence. The illusion shattered. The slave girl opened her mouth and screamed. The torch and the blood. The sound struck the stone walls. The ritual chants ceased instantly. The women stopped their movements. Panic erupted as the slave called the women together, the crowd of matrons converging in the hallway. Demonstrating immediate and authoritative command, Aurelia ordered the rites to halt. She commanded that the sacred relics of the goddess be covered and hidden from the profane eyes of the intruder. Aurelia moved to the doors, placed her hands on the wood, and shut them. The iron hinges ground against the stone. The exits sealed. Walking to a sconce, she picked up a burning torch, the flame casting a light against the veiled statues. She walked through the house, holding the fire high above her head. The women stood in silence. Aurelia stepped in front of the first woman and looked into her face. She stepped to the next. She looked into her face. The flame illuminated their features one by one as Aurelia searched every place, the light moving from the atrium to the inner chambers. Clodius fled the corridor, running toward the chamber of the slave girl who had initially admitted him. He crossed the threshold and crouched in the darkness of the room, waiting. But Aurelia's torch pierced the doorway. The flame reflected on his skin. The women saw him. The insulted Vestals and the patrician matrons converged, flying upon him. Their hands grasped the fabric of his disguise. They pulled. They tore the borrowed garments from his body, the saffron linen ripping into shreds. Their fingernails scratched his skin. They violently drove him through the corridors, pushing his body toward the street. Clodius fell onto the exterior paving stones, lying naked as blood ran from his wounds. The doors closed behind him. The lock turned. The physical boundary of the Domus Publica had been breached, but the true fracture was far deeper. His reputation, and potentially his life, hung in the balance as the night wind moved through the city streets, and the Tiber flowed toward the sea, its waters touching the stone bridges. The cold Stylus. Dawn broke over Rome, the sun hitting the roof of the temple. The scandal erupted across the city like wildfire. The Senate convened, magistrates walking to their seats as the rumor of the night's events moved through the forum. The affair became noised abroad, citizens speaking in the squares in paralyzed horror. The Vestal virgins were forced to perform the rites all over again in their entirety to cleanse the spiritual contamination of the city. Caesar heard the report. He sat in his study. He did not succumb to rage. He did not issue a defense, nor did he summon witnesses to his private quarters. His religious authority as Pontifex Maximus had been challenged, his honor as a husband insulted. But Caesar recognized the volatile political power of Clodius and the populist mob that supported him. Having once lamented before the statue of Alexander the Great that he had yet to leave behind any memorable achievements, he could not stop here. He reached for a stylus. He wrote a decree. He divorced Pompeia. The wax received the impression, and the document severed the marriage. The action required a single moment, and the union ended before a trial even began. His broken engagement to Casutia, marriage to Cornelia, and second marriage to Pompeia had all been calculated steps toward higher status. Caesar divorced Pompeia for the exact same reason he had married her: himself. He placed the stylus on the table. Ancient biographers would later eagerly suggest that Pompeia's maidservant actively facilitated the entry, hinting at a scandalous liaison. However, rigorous examination of the historical record by modern scholars reveals zero evidentiary basis to confirm Pompeia's knowledge or complicity. But to Caesar, her innocence or guilt was entirely irrelevant. She was excised from the historical narrative to preserve the impenetrable facade of authoritative purity required by his office. The machinery of justice. The Republic demanded a response. The patricians and the matrons demanded justice for the profanation of the sacred rites. The Roman Senate, recognizing an opportunity to crush a rising populist threat, decrees a formal legal investigation. In early 61 BC, the Roman Senate formally referred the incident to the College of Pontiffs. The institution issued a chilling decree. The intrusion was designated a nephis, an act contrary to divine law. This transformed a private trespassing incident into a profound sociological and political crisis of the state. The strict senators regarded any hesitation as a scandal to the order. Messala, the consul, remained peremptory, and the magistrates drafted a bill for an indictment, submitting the parchment to the assembly in the forum. The conservative faction, the self-proclaimed defenders of the Republic, mobilized to eliminate Clodius. They despise his leverage over the urban mob. They engineer a tribunal. A jury must be formed to adjudicate the sacrilege. Previously, only the supreme elite, the senators, were allowed to sit on a jury. As a result, when corrupt governors or high magistrates were dragged into court, Their fellow aristocrats in the jury box would simply take the bribes or use their connections to hand out blanket acquittals. The practice of protecting their own was absolute. To stop this, Rome shed a massive amount of blood to completely overhaul the jury system. Just 9 years earlier, in 70 BC, Pompey and Crassus pushed through the Lex Aurelia to bring the corrupt Senate to heel. They fractured the jury pool into perfect thirds. 1/3 senators, 1/3 equites, the newly wealthy equestrian class, and 1/3 affluent plebeians. It was the ultimate system of checks and balances, an anti-corruption safeguard. It was designed to ensure that no single class could ever again hijack the courts with money and power. When the special tribunal bill was proposed, the conservative faction of the Senate attempted to insert a poison pill provision, allowing the praetor to directly select the jury, ensuring Clodius' political elimination. However, the tribune Fufius Calenus, acting on Clodius's orders, mobilized the plebeian mobs to physically seize the assembly and fiercely thwart the clause. In the end, the conservative senators were forced to retreat. The jurors are chosen by lot, assembling a remarkably scandalous crew onto the jury bench. The prosecution prepares to annihilate Clodius through the rigid application of divine and secular law. When the warm winds of May arrived, Publius Clodius Pulcher found himself standing trial. The legal charge was incestum, which, in Roman religious and legal terminology, denoted a severe violation of religious chastity and ritual purity, not a modern familial connotation. The judges took their seats upon the wooden benches. The populace gathered in the open space. The mob favored Clodius. The nobility sought his destruction. The dividing line cut through the city. Fighting for his political survival, Clodius attempted to construct an impenetrable legal alibi. He stood before the magistrates and boldly claimed that on the night of the festival, he was not even in Rome. He swore he was at Interamna, a town roughly 90 miles north. In an era before mechanical transport, 90 miles was an insurmountable physical barrier. If true, the intruder could not have been him. This lie brought forward one of the greatest minds of the Republic, the consular senator Marcus Tullius Cicero. Behind the scenes, Cicero's wife, Terentia, interfered in political matters. She maintained a persistent stance and held a private grudge against the defendant. The citizens spoke of her as his colleague when he served as consul. She spoke into Cicero's ear, inciting the advocate. A man deeply devoted to the traditional laws and moral sanctity of Rome, Cicero was appalled by the brazen perjury. Wearing the purple-bordered toga of a former consul, carrying wooden tablets in his left hand, Cicero walked to the center of the tribunal. He stepped up, opened his mouth, and unleashed an invective. He laid out the timeline of the night, systematically and ruthlessly dismantling the defendant's plea. Cicero swore under oath that he had spoken face to face with Clodius in his own house in Rome, a mere 3 hours before the alleged infiltration. This was meticulously recorded in his private correspondence, the Epistulae ad Atticum. His words struck the stone of the forum, and the alibi completely collapsed. The crowd listened as the dust rose from the ground under the shifting feet of the citizens. Then, the prosecution called their key witness. Caesar walked to the platform. He stepped up the wooden stairs and stood before the judges. The crowd fell silent, expecting the Pontifex Maximus to deliver the killing blow to the man who had just dismantled his household. The magistrate asked Caesar for his testimony. Caesar looked at the judges. He stated flatly that he knew absolutely nothing of the affair. He declared he possessed no information regarding the events inside his house, refusing to say a single word against Clodius. The statement hung in the air, baffling the prosecution. Aurelia and his sister Julia sat nearby. They had already provided the court with an exact, detailed account of the infiltration and the lute player. Caesar deliberately contradicted his mother. He contradicted his sister. He stood motionless on the planks. Modern historians view this moment through a critical lens. The primary sources are deeply fractured. While Cicero's contemporary letters burn with the political animosity of the conservative Optimates faction, modern scholarship recognizes this trial as a ruthless political battlefield. Caesar's strategic silence was a cold, calculated maneuver to avoid alienating Clodius's powerful base, securing a vital future alliance with the populist populares. The prosecutor leaned forward, formulating a trap. "Why, then, did you divorce Pompeia?" he shrewdly inquired. The question echoed across the silent forum. The trap snapped shut. If Caesar truly knew nothing, if he believed Clodius was innocent, the sudden divorce lacked justification. If the divorce possessed justification, Caesar was committing perjury in front of the Republic. The wind moved the folds of Caesar's toga. He did not shift his weight. He did not look at Pompeia. As recorded by Plutarch in his biographical texts, Caesar looked at his interrogators and stated calmly, "Caesar's wife must be above suspicion." It is one of the most famous declarations in ancient history. Yet, contemporary accounts, including Cicero's exhaustive letters, do not record this exact phrase. It is a retroactive distillation from much later, in the early 2nd century AD. The Roman historian Suetonius immortalized the sentiment with similar clarity. "Because I maintain that the members of my family should be free from suspicion, as well as from accusation." He stepped down from the platform. The reply stopped all further questions. He walked away, descending the stairs, leaving the tribunal. He amputated a member of his own family without a second thought, discarding an arguably innocent wife under the pretext of public perception. Clementia was valid only for his enemy, not for his wife. Instead, Caesar made a new client, Clodius. The spaces between. The sun continued its arc across the sky. The 56 judges held their wax tablets. The mob shouted from the edges of the forum, while the nobles watched from the steps of the temples. The judges gripped their styluses. They feared to condemn because of the mob. They feared to acquit because of the nobility. They pressed the iron points into the wax, obscuring the letters, writing their verdicts with illegible marks so no citizen could read the decisions. But the heavy influence of gold moved in the open. The venal judges accepted the coin, widespread bribery funded by immense wealth, which many historians have long pointed toward Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus harbors a deep hatred for Cicero for defeating his tool, Catiline, and blocking his land bills. With his own money, he dismantles the very foundation of the jury system he himself had established with a new law just 9 years prior. Bribery floods the jury. Intimidation chokes the remaining holdouts. The law had been purchased. The magistrate collected the tablets. 31 jurors voted for acquittal. 25 for conviction. By a margin of merely 6 votes, Clodius received an acquittal. He walked free. The Republic proves it can be purchased. The trial concluded. The crowd dispersed. Cicero returned to the Senate, the acquittal lying heavy in the center of the chamber. An altercation erupted between Cicero and Clodius on the floor of the building. Cicero returned to his desk and wrote a connected oration, his letters weeping for the dying soul of Rome. As the ink dried on the parchment, he documented the profanation, the corrupt means, and the horrifying realization that a terminal disease was infecting the Republic. Cicero's definitive testimony, grounded in truth, was no match for the overwhelming corruption of the era. Caesar showcased the terrifying ability to completely divorce himself from emotional entanglement, birthing an unfeeling political machinery where optics superseded reality, and where truth was entirely negotiable. Weeks after the scandal broke, the Vestal virgins returned to the Domus Publica. They performed the rite again, without his wife. Statues veiled. Doors barred. Every male sent into the street. The same words. The same silence. No voice answered that did not belong. No one asked a stranger her name again.